On December 6, 1975, 40-year-old Wesley Diggs came home at around 4 in the afternoon to find his entire family shot to death. His wife, 39-year-old Jean, had been shot in the chest and forehead, and his 4 children were found dead in various parts of the house. This was a shocking crime that no one could have expected in the quiet township of Teaneck, New Jersey. As a black family in a majority white neighborhood, the Diggs were always at risk of experiencing racial violence, but the case was far too complicated for that to be the case. Today, we're going to dive into the murder of the Diggs family. Wesley Diggs was the sort of man that people had always expected great things from. His tall, slender form cut a striking figure into every room he walked in and gave him a distinct talent for basketball. Wesley wasn't interested in becoming a professional athlete, though. His aspirations lay in more grounded pursuits. He wanted to be a business wonder, but it went way beyond thought. Wesley didn't just want one business. He wanted an entire chain of businesses, an empire of sorts, and he got to work creating this empire from an early age. Much of his entrepreneurship was centered around Harlem, a neighborhood of Manhattan that was experiencing a massive economic boom in the mid-20th century. Wesley, being the consummate entertainer with his subtle charm and undeniable magnetism, decided to go into the hospitality business by opening a bar. There's some evidence to suggest that Wesley was a real ladies' man throughout his life. However, sometime during the 1950s, he met someone that made him want to settle down and start a family. There's no record of when Wesley met Jean Marie, the woman that would one day become Mrs. Diggs, but we can say for sure that they started dating in the early to mid-1950s. They hit it off well enough that they decided to get married not long after meeting, and in 1958, they had their first child, a daughter whom they named Audrey. Wesley and Jean had another baby a little over a year later. It was another daughter, whom they decided to name Allison. Their family was growing, and Wesley's financial aspirations were growing alongside them. He'd spend 16 to 18 hours a day managing his various business affairs, all while Jean took care of the kids at home. In 1963, Jean gave birth to the family's first son, who became Wesley Jr. It's fair to say that Wesley had always wanted a son. The fact that he named him after himself suggests that he wanted him to carry on his legacy, potentially running his businesses after he decided to retire. These businesses certainly did need someone to take over at some point because they were growing at an exponential rate. By 1967, Wesley eyed a bar called the 19th Hole that was about to close down. After applying for bank loans, Wesley was able to buy the property, which he converted into yet another bar called Diggs' Den. Located at 320 West 145th Street, Diggs' Den was a very popular establishment. It, along with another bar on Amsterdam Avenue called Cafe Lounge, gave Wesley enough of an income that he started to think about moving into a nicer neighborhood. He'd heard about a township in New Jersey called Teaneck. With a population of 20 to 30,000 people, it was the exact opposite of the loud, dirty city Wesley was familiar with. That's possibly why he wanted to move his family there, and in 1969 he saved up enough money to make the move. Teaneck was a place where Wesley's kids could play without having to worry about the dangers of the street. It was a place where the Diggs could enjoy a quiet family life. However, there was one problem. It was an entirely white neighborhood, and the Diggs would be the first black family on the street. You might think that this would raise some eyebrows and cause some tension, but couldn't be further from the truth. The Diggs were welcomed by the community with open arms and were widely respected by their neighbors. They became especially close friends with the Murphys next door, and the kids had no trouble integrating into Teaneck's community. Audrey and Allison both started attending Teaneck High School, where they were well liked by their peers. Audrey had taken after her father, becoming a star athlete in the school's softball, volleyball, and basketball teams, where she was described as someone that cared about her fellow teammates. She didn't have a particular passion for any of the sports. According to Cheryl Miller Porter, the school's PE teacher at the time, she was just a gym rat and fitness freak who wanted to do her best. And of course, she wanted to make sure that the other members of her team were able to play safely and have fun at the same time. As for Allison, there's a possibility that she had a very quirky personality. As the middle child, she wasn't quite as outgoing as her big sister, and there's evidence to suggest that she greatly valued her privacy. Perhaps the greatest piece of evidence of all was the fact that her bedroom was in the attic. Most people might hate to stay in a part of the home so famous for stories of hauntings, or at the very least dilapidation. In Allison's case, it became a safe space, a haven from the world. She could often be found hidden up there, oblivious to the rest of the world, engaged deeply in some artistic project or philosophical pursuit. Much of this is speculation, but it's in line with what we know about her life. The truth is, we'll simply never know what any of the Diggs were really like, because each and every one of them is dead now. But overall, the Diggs were the dictionary definition of an all-American family. They got along with their neighbors, worked hard to contribute to the community, and also found time to go to church. They were frequent congregants at the local Presbyterian church, where their social circle grew as other churchgoers took a liking to this seemingly perfect family. Not long after they moved to Teaneck, Wesley and Jean added another son named Roger to their family, and it's possible that with 2 daughters and 2 sons, they felt that their family was finally complete. Wesley certainly showed how successful he was by making the move to Teaneck. It was safer than Harlem, and allowed his family to enjoy a slice of suburban nirvana that not many black people got to enjoy at the time. However, it's also possible that Wesley wanted to move his family far away from the city because of his secret second life. As we've already established, Wesley was the sort of person that had multiple business affairs to manage, but those weren't the only kinds of affairs he was involved in. He was known for having multiple extramarital affairs, which added strain to the family dynamic. It's uncertain just how many affairs Wesley was involved in, but we do know that he had at least one extramarital girlfriend at the time of the incident. But with that said, Wesley wasn't exactly keeping anything from his wife. Indeed, she apparently knew all about the affairs, or at least the girlfriend he had around the time of the incident. Was she happy about it? No, not at all, but according to Wesley, she accepted that this was just how things were. Of course, it's entirely possible that he misrepresented his wife's opinion of his infidelity. Perhaps Jean was tired of him stepping out, and there's some evidence to indicate that she was deeply depressed at least after the move to Teaneck, such as her saying that her family would be better off with God. It didn't help that Wesley tended to disappear for longer and longer stretches. He'd sometimes be gone for 2 or 3 days, during which he'd spend most of his time on his business ventures, but would spare at least a few hours each night for this mysterious girlfriend. It was after one of these 3-day-long absences that Wesley came home to find something that would haunt him to the end of his days. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. It was around 4 o'clock on a cold Saturday afternoon when Wesley returned home. It's possible that he was looking forward to spending the weekend with his family. All evidence points to him attending church regularly, which creates an intense moral contrast with him spending the previous night at his girlfriend's home. When he entered his house, he noticed that it was unusually quiet. This was a home with 2 teenagers, a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, at least 2 of whom would be running around and screaming at any given moment. And yet, if a pin had fallen to the floor, Wesley would have heard it crystal clear just then. Something was wrong. Wesley may even have been able to feel it. He might have felt those pin pricks in the back of his neck as his hair stood on end. The body has a way of innately knowing when things aren't quite how they're supposed to be. Wesley may even have felt a sense of dread as he called out and received no response. He headed upstairs, perhaps assuming that everyone was taking an afternoon nap. He checked his bedroom, but there was no sign of Jean. He then explored further until he found Audrey, his firstborn, the darling of Teaneck High School, shot 3 times in the head and twice in the back. She was laying on Wesley Jr.'s bed, with Wesley Jr. himself later being found in Roger's room with his little brother. Both of the boys had also been shot multiple times in the back of the head and were lying face down. It's hard to imagine what state of mind Wesley was in by this point. He'd just found out that at least 3 of his children were dead. It's highly likely that his mind was racing. He may have been screaming, sobbing, but he still had 2 family members to look for, so he ran down to the rec room and the basement, where he was hoping he'd find someone hiding from whoever had attacked his home. However, there were no survivors in the basement. All Wesley found there was the body of Jean, his wife of nearly 2 decades. Unlike the children, Jean had been shot from the front. The bullet had burst through her forehead, and there was another wound in her chest. Wesley may have been hoping that both Jean and Allison had hunkered down in the basement. Considering that Jean's bullet-riddled body was the only discovery he made down there, this meant only one thing: Allison was dead too. After finding Audrey and the boys upstairs, Wesley may have intentionally avoided the door leading to Allison's attic bedroom. Perhaps he was afraid of what he'd find up there, and as it turns out, he was right to feel this way. Allison had only been shot once in the back of the head, indicating that she'd been running away, and that she may have been the last family member to die as well, considering she was shot far fewer times than her siblings. With the death of his entire family now confirmed, Wesley ran out onto the street, screaming for help. The first house that he ran to belonged to Edward Murphy, a neighbor that he'd formed a close friendship with over the years and whose daughter happened to be a nurse. She entered the Diggs residence and confirmed that each member was dead. Teaneck Township Police worked with police from the wider Bergen County area to try to make sense of this sudden tragedy. The first suspect inevitably ended up being Wesley himself, and considering that up to 90% of cases of family annihilation are perpetrated by the father, this was an understandable lead to chase. Police eventually estimated that the family had been killed sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. the previous night. As it turned out, Wesley had the perfect alibi. He'd been with his girlfriend, who could confirm his location at the time of the murders. Prior to that, Wesley had been at a political fundraiser in Harlem, a fact that was once again attested to by a number of eyewitnesses. But despite him having an alibi, police continued to look into Wesley's life. They found out that he was about $100,000 in debt due to owning and operating 4 bars. He'd even remortgaged his house to fund his ventures, and he was paying the massive debt off in weekly installments. This created at least one possible motive for him to kill his entire family: the life insurance money. A large enough payout would have given Wesley considerable breathing room, and potentially even pay off his debts in full. Perhaps he could have even had his girlfriend and friends lie to bolster his alibi, promising to share some of the money with them if they helped him out. But as it turned out, the life insurance payout was a measly $6,500, so this theory died as soon as Wesley received the amount. As if that wasn't enough, Wesley also consented to a polygraph test which he passed. Simply put, there was no way Wesley could have done the crime based on the evidence found, and yet police spent countless man-hours and resources trying to pin the murders on him. All the while, he had to do the most painful thing a father can do: arrange a funeral for his wife and kids. If you needed any indication of just how beloved the Diggs were, look no further than their funeral. Wesley arranged a viewing at Bentis Funeral Home in Harlem for the 12th of December, with many of Allison and Audrey's friends from Teaneck making the journey to Manhattan to see them one last time. They reportedly broke down in tears and became hysterical, unable to comprehend the senseless violence that had taken their friends from them. According to news reports, it was the fact that Allison and Audrey were formally dressed that made them break down, likely because they dressed informally and stylishly in life, and the fact that they were so formal in death just made it all the more real. The funeral was arranged for the next morning, with the service held at the Presbyterian church the Diggs had frequented ever since they moved to Teaneck. About 500 people packed into the pews, with a further 300 to 400 in the overflow room. Many of the 40 ushers organizing this massive crowd were Allison and Audrey's school friends. The crowd was a mix of white and black mourners, all of whom came to show their respects to a family that deserved better, and a father that now had the grim responsibility of laying them to rest. For his part, Wesley gave heartbreaking personal statements for each member of his family. He expressed his sorrow and guilt for not being there that night, stating that he'd failed to protect his family. It's fair to say that the mourners were seeing a broken man that day, someone who'd never recover from what he'd been through. After the service, a procession of 90 cars followed the hearse to George Washington Memorial Park, where Jean, Audrey, Allison, Wesley Jr., and Roger were laid to rest. Once this was done, Wesley yet again had to deal with the police breathing down his neck. The Diggs murders were never solved to this day, and considering they happened just under half a century ago, it seems unlikely that they ever will be. But even so, there have been some theories put forward that attempt to explain what happened that night. One theory comes from a New York City detective sergeant named James Vitti, who claimed to have received a tip from an informant named Tecumseh Robinson about 2 years after the murders occurred. It bears mentioning that Robinson was a murder suspect at the time, and he was paid for any information he provided. According to this informant, who was a regular customer at one of Wesley's bars, the Diggs family annihilation was basically a robbery gone wrong. He claimed that a man who was already imprisoned for an unrelated murder was responsible for it, along with the man's girlfriend, who Jean apparently knew. Robinson further stated that Jean let the woman in that night because she knew her, and that the female culprit was looking for cash that she believed Wesley brought home every night from his bars. When she wasn't able to find the cash, she killed the family and left. There are many problems with this theory, and it's almost certainly untrue. For starters, there were no signs of a robbery. Nothing valuable had been taken from the home. Even if this supposed culprit had failed to find the cash, one would assume she'd taken something of value, especially considering that she'd already killed people. Anyone would want some form of compensation for their troubles, so the fact that the valuables were untouched. And then there's the informant's behavior to consider. Though Robinson passed a polygraph test before getting paid, he eventually received between $300 to $500 for his information, which in 1977 was equivalent to $1,500 to $2,500 in today's money. After passing the polygraph test, Robinson was fitted with a wire and put under surveillance. The idea was that he'd be able to find the woman he claimed was responsible for the murder and help bring her to justice. Instead, Robinson slipped into a Harlem bar, escaped through a side entrance, and was never seen or heard from again. Police later found his car with the microphone and recording equipment smashed to bits inside it. When Robinson's claims were presented to Wesley, he stated that he never kept cash at home and said it was unlikely that Jean would have known such a woman, let alone allowed her into their home. Just like every other lead, this theory went nowhere, and Wesley was left to contend with the loss with no closure. The constant stress of being investigated destroyed Wesley's health. He moved to Manhattan after the murders, likely unable to deal with being in Teaneck anymore. Everything must have reminded him of his family, and the only way he could survive was by starting over. He sought a fresh start, a necessary step for healing after such immense loss. Of course, skeptics that believe theories about his involvement in the murders might say that he got over the guilt of being with a mistress while his family was murdered surprisingly quickly, though they do so without any real evidence. It's unknown if he stayed with the woman he was with on the night of the murders, although he did have another daughter in 1981. Around that time, the Reverend Bob Chase wrote a book titled Diggs that talked about the unsolved murders and told a bit of Wesley's side of the story. He spent the remainder of his life in Harlem, the place of danger he'd escaped from to keep his family safe, which ironically somehow put them in the line of fire. How could he have known? Who'd think that moving to peaceful, quiet Teaneck would be a death sentence for a family from Harlem? Wesley never got over what happened. A combination of trauma and stress greatly weakened his heart, and in October of 1987, He died of a heart attack in Harlem. All traces of the Diggs family are now gone, and the daughter Wesley, fathered in 1981, has maintained a low profile. So what do you think of this case? Were the police right to suspect Wesley Diggs, or was it just another case of racial profiling? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.